President Donald Trump signed an executive order early in this second term dismantling the Department of Education. A creation of the Jimmy Carter era, the Department of Education is nearly 50 years old, and in those 5 decades, there has not been an improvement of student outcomes. In fact, performance has gotten worse. As part of the President's cabinet, the Secretary of Education is tasked with carrying out his priorities. Secretary Linda McMahon built a billion-dollar business in the private sector, and she served on Connecticut's State Board of Education. President Trump believes she is the right person to wind down an inefficient government agency. She joins me on the Capitol Hill Show. Madam Secretary, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim. It's a pleasure to be with you on the show.
You know, the Department of Education, when we talk about that, the simple question would be, what does it do? But I'm going to change it up just a little bit and say, what is it supposed to do, and how successful has it been at doing that?
Well, I'm going to change it up a little bit more. I'm going to tell you what it doesn't do, because I think there is a lot of thought out there about what the Department of Education is actually responsible for. It is not responsible for curriculum. We don't hire teachers. We don't decide what books go into the classroom. We don't do any of those kinds of things. We don't establish, what the local policies ought to be in the states. And that's what the President would like to see more of, that the education really is returned to states so that parents and teachers and local administrators have more input as to what is being taught. Now, what the Department of Education does do is to act as a pathway for funding that is appropriated by Congress through Title I funding, through IDEA, which is for special education teaching, for other grants, competitive grants, and make sure that money gets funneled appropriately into the states.
You know, I was looking online, and it outlines 6 areas in specific, but I was looking at some of those, and it said, among the 6 were collecting data, conducting research and technical assistance, and also fostering innovation. And I just thought, those are really broad descriptions for hundreds of billions of dollars. Is there a way to tighten that up, and is that part of your job?
Well, it is part of what we're doing. By collecting data, one of the things that we make sure happens, every other year is the NAEP analysis that happens, and that's really the nation's report card. And that's what flagged for us this year of the continuing decline in our education, because the nation's report card shows that our teachers, that our education system is not doing a good job for our students. I mean, when you look at 8th graders that are reading at 30% proficiency, I mean, 70% are not. Right. And, even worse in math scores. So we're just not doing a very good job, but it's important for us to collect that kind of data to make sure that it's comparing apples to apples. But there are a lot of other data that gets collected that's just spending money. I mean, there are a lot of tests and research, almost $1 billion, and all kinds of tests that were being run. Let me give you an example. There was a recent survey that was done on teachers to see how they were utilizing the programs that had already been tested. And we found out that they weren't utilizing them. But we spent $3 million on that kind of additional testing. Now, that kind of data we don't need to run and collect, because I think that's a waste of taxpayer dollars. But the testing to compare students on a national level to see how they really are comparing, and it's consistent. It's done every other year. The NAEP scores, I think, is very important for us to keep. You mentioned the money, and it's a very American response to see, oh, there's a problem here. They throw money at it, and then it may or may not make a difference. And as you pointed out, those scores indicate all that money is not making a difference. So let me give you a money stat that'll probably blow your mind. Since the Department of Education was established in 1980, we've spent over $3 trillion in education, and we've seen the performance scores continue to decline. We're not doing something right. Well,
and you've only been in as secretary for a short period of time, but you've already cut staff at the Department of Education from roughly 4,100 down to 2,200-ish. Tell me what you're doing there, parsing. You know, when you carve that out, I always think that's a good thing. You're becoming more efficient, but there's a lot of screams in the public right now. Oh, does the Trump administration not care about education?
Well, the Trump administration cares very much about education, but I will digress for just a moment. When the president appointed me and nominated me and asked me to serve as the Secretary of Education, he was very clear. He said, I do not think we need a Department of Education. I think those funds can be better spent elsewhere, returned to the states. So it is my job to put myself out of a job. He said I would have achieved success when I've actually fired myself. And so part of this, the RIF, the reduction in workforce, was streamlining, getting ready as we start to bring the department down a bit. But I think, I come from the private sector, and I've done restructuring in a company 2 or 3 times. It's a painful thing to go through, but what you really find is over the years, you get mission creep. You add people to do this. So I can do it better if I add more people to do this. And you really find you really don't need that many people, and you can do more with less when you really focus on it.
You beat me to the punch there, because I was going to say you work and had tremendous success in private industry. And if you just look at the picture from beginning to end, you took something that was tiny, you built $1 billion business. But that was going to be my question, is along the way, there are bumps, there are different times where you've got to tighten the belt. And I was going to ask that, is this similar that, gosh, we've got goals here, we would love to see good education, but maybe tightening the belt is part of that?
Well, tightening the belt across all the agencies. That's what we're looking at, the reduction in workforce, because the president's absolutely determined to balance the budget. Now, he doesn't want to cut out those people that are necessary to do the function of what the government really should be doing. But I think what's being found across all agencies is there is room to reduce the workforce and to cut budgets. And that's part of what we're doing at Ed. And, you know, when you do a reduction in force, I found it in the private sector. Sometimes, you know, your goal is to just cut fat. Sometimes you cut a little too deep in the muscle. So we brought some people back into the workforce because we want to make sure that we are absolutely delivering what we need to deliver. So I think we have the good balance, right balance now. And we're adding a few people, but I think we're pretty much where we need to be right now.
Let's shift gears. Let's talk about student loans. And I'm going to oversimplify this, but let's say you want to go to school. You take out a loan. You get an education, you repay the loan. To me, that seems like a logical progression of the 4 steps. But there seem to be a number of folks who have decided they'd rather not repay the loan. President Biden kept talking about forgiveness. We're going to forgive the loans. And I scratch my head because the money doesn't just magically disappear in pixie dust. If somebody is owed money, it needs to be paid back. So what does that term forgive mean? Who is paying those loans off?
Well, you know, you aren't forgiving or getting rid of the loan. As you said, what you're doing is just transferring the debt to others, which is really the taxpayers of America. So why should, you know, plumbers, electricians, auto mechanics, many of them who might not have gone to college, why should they be paying for people who took out loans to go to college, maybe didn't graduate, maybe just decided not to pay? But I do have to say, though, that during the last administration, if you were someone who had a loan and you kept thinking, hey, why should I be paying on my loan because I keep hearing the president talk about forgiving my loan, I might not have to repay it, so I'm not going to repay it. But since March of 2020, when COVID was really hitting hard, you know, there was a suspension of repayment, but since that time, it was never resumed. So we have added $60 billion in debt since the COVID era for student loans. And so now we just announced this past Monday on May 5th, we sent a letter to those who were borrowers who were not repaying that they would be expected to start repayment. They could go online at and find out what the different programs are. We have a loan simulator program that you can plug in money to see, okay, this is how much I could afford to pay back. We've extended the hours of the servicers to be able to help. And that website, studentaid.gov, I couldn't remember for a second, studentaid.gov, and give you different options to look at. But, you know, if you are defaulting on your loan, that goes against your credit score. So you can't buy a house, right. You can't buy a car. So get out of default and let's work out a reasonable program for repayment. This is not, something that we're looking to really come down on people. We just want you to step up to your responsibility. And we have, some AI services to answer through Aiden is our AI helper, if you will, and can answer an awful lot of questions about how to go about getting back into the payment program. But there's no excuse not to get back into the payment program.
There are a lot of people that will say the program is flawed, needs to be changed, needs to be fixed. But I always felt like when President Biden talked in terms of forgiving or paying off those loans for people, you still had the same system in place for students that are coming on board now. So are there some changes that should be made to the system long term to make sure that students are taking on affordable debt, or at least are aware of what their responsibilities are going to be?
Right, and it's such a broad question. I mean, it really gets involved in the universities as well. Do you know that a student can borrow as much as a university says is the cost of attendance? So if one university says it's going to cost you $90,000 a year to attend, you can borrow $90,000. If another one, maybe teaching the same courses, maybe giving the same degree, says it's going to cost $20,000 a year, well, that's what you borrow. Now, there's something out of whack there. We should be able to have colleges make school, I think, more affordable. And I'm not opposed to universities having a little skin in the game, too, for students, who are going to those universities. Many of them don't complete their education, but the loan is outstanding, so they never have that opportunity to repay. And they were getting the loan, based on the fact that they were going to college, they were going to get a good job, they're going to be able to repay the money. So they drop out, or circumstances prevent them from finishing. But or they're involved in courses and they get jobs, especially more in the liberal arts. And I'm all for liberal arts, don't misunderstand. But the payment in those subjects is not as high as, for instance, for an engineer or doctor, et cetera, or technology. And so I think there should be much more transparency for students to know, well, if I take out this loan and I incur all of this debt and I graduate a quarter or sometimes $500,000 in debt, what kind of a job am I going to have? How long is it going to take me, if ever, to repay that loan? And so I think more transparency should be made to the students who are now applying, more information given to families and students to say, this is the kind of income you can expect from this kind of a job based on national figures. Is this the kind of debt you want to incur? And that's reasonable. I think that makes sense. And we're trying to make our applications now, working on programs with our applications that will provide some of that information for borrowers.
Little dose of reality.
Little dose of reality.
Let's talk about Harvard. And I don't want to pick on Harvard, but we're going to pick on Harvard a little bit. Harvard is arguably the greatest university on planet Earth. You have some of the most successful, some of the most powerful people on the planet are graduates of Harvard. They have an endowment of $53.2 billion, with a B, billion dollars. So they're pretty well squared away for a while. Lest they squander $53 billion, they're in good shape. And yet somehow they are still on grant programs. They are still, my question is a simple one. Why is a school like Harvard, private university with all that money put away, getting even 1 penny of tax dollar money?
It's something that's been in place, not just Harvard, but universities, throughout the country for many, many years. And these are tax-free dollars that go into these endowments. So I think that there are a lot of good investments that the government can make quite often. A lot of research that goes on at universities, I think, is top shelf. However, when you have that kind of an endowment and that kind of money you could invest in more and more research, I think that we need to look at whether or not those tax dollars should continue to come in to fund them, especially if the universities are not abiding by federal law. So if you're taking federal dollars and you're not abiding by federal law, then we have to take a strong, serious look at that. Harvard has, for a long, long time allowed anti-Semitism protests on its campus. I mean, these are civil rights violations. These are not, and it's argued by many universities where you're trying to put some limit on our First Amendment rights for free speech. No, that's not what this is. This is civil rights. When you have encampments on campuses, when students are feeling unsafe to walk across campus to go to class. When students, like happened in Columbia, they're barricaded in a library and students pounding on a glass wall yelling, "Death to Israel, death to the United States," and Jewish students are really afraid to walk across campus, then those institutions receiving federal dollars, we're saying, no, that's just not going to continue to happen. You're just going to have to abide by the law.
Back on the local level, I think when I was a kid, I went to Fairmount Elementary School, but the focus was, the old phrase was reading, writing, and arithmetic. But now we may say science, math, and English, but there's a core focus of what we hope our kids are getting educated with. But it seems, and I'm saying seems because I don't know, it seems like there is some time lost on a daily basis in the classroom in many parts of America to social engineering, to deciding whether or not young men and women should be sharing locker rooms, to deciding a number of issues that go way afield of science and math and English. Is there anything the Department of Education can or is doing on that front, or am I imagining that any of that is going on?
Well, first of all, the Department of Education clearly has a responsibility to make sure that schools are, again, abiding by the law in terms of Title IX, which is keeping men and boys out of girls' sports. I think the president has made that abundantly clear that we are really going to enforce that with schools that are receiving, federal funding, which is almost, all K through 12 schools. We have to look at that. The other issue is FERPA, which is parents having the right to know what is going on with their children in the classroom. You cannot apply sunblock to a child or give a child an aspirin without calling and getting permission from the parents. However, you can talk about gender transformation. You can talk about all of those things without a parent being involved. And there are some schools that even withhold that information from parents. Not only are they not asking permission or inviting the parents in, but they're withholding the information from parents. Now, I have to tell you, as a parent and as a grandmother, that is absolutely, it flies in the face of common sense that you could do something so altering to a child's personality, their mental state, their life, to encourage them to make gender transforming decisions without input at such a young age. It just is absolutely unconscionable to me that school systems would be doing that. And so the Department of Education is making sure we've brought a couple of cases, some in Maine, some in Florida, that we're looking at, Maine and California, that we're looking at to make sure that that's not happening.
The president is working very hard in the Middle East right now to bring about peace, to bring stability, to bring prosperity. Does it impact those decisions when you think of the culture of the region there or in other parts of the world? Does it impact his ability to be effective, or Secretary Rubio's team to be effective when these countries see our discussions, rather than being about how far to push the science program, we're debating whether or not boys should be in the girls' locker room? And that, I think, that's within the United States, that's a debate. That's a big debate. And I think it was 80 or more % people are supportive of the president on that. But I think when other parts of the world look at that, I worry if it impacts things that have nothing to do even with education.
Well, I've not sat down and talked to the president. Does this impact his ability when he's sitting next to the Crown Prince and how he's doing this week? But I can tell you this: when we have looked at our scores, when we have seen our NAEP scores, our Nations Report Card scores, continue to decline, what we have found across the world is that they don't talk about ideology issues in the classroom. They are teaching reading, they are teaching math, they are teaching science. They're teaching all of them. They are focusing on those subjects in the classroom. They are spending their time and their dollars teaching. In our country, not only in our country, but here specifically, if up through third grade, you're learning to read. After third grade, you're reading to learn. And if you cannot read proficiently when you leave third grade, you can't continue to learn. That is why, our scores are so abysmal. It's because we don't have reading and math proficiency. And what we're seeing, and I'm glad to see it, and we are supporting at the Department of Education more focus on returning to classical schools, classical teaching, the science of reading. In fact, we've seen states have incredible success in Mississippi and Louisiana, even a couple of other states that are implementing, getting back to teaching reading by phonics. And we had the Mississippi Miracle was exactly that. And they came up from being next to last in reading proficiency to up to about number 21 in the country, which is a wonderful success story. And last year with the NAEP scores, Louisiana was the really bright spot because it is the only state that actually showed improvement. Now, I've been touring charter schools throughout the country and looking at different kinds of curriculum. And I've really seen the success in bringing back this classical education, and I hope to see more of it. Now, that has to be balanced with STEM learning. It has to be balanced with all of that, but that's at a little bit different level. Let's get the basics under our belt and focus on that so that our students are prepared then to really learn at their best level.
Let's finish the discussion by going full circle. We started by you saying the president and in turn you think it's important to give as much decision-making to the states and to the local school boards as possible on some of those curriculum things. And I worry sometimes that there's a one-size-fits-all approach. But I think of, the students in Bangor, Maine are going to be different than the students, their needs may be different than the students in East LA. We want them all to learn to read and write, but how their cultural world is in a small town versus a big city may require some differences. And in my view, your local school boards are going to have a better feel than some people in Washington, D.C. on that. Is that part of what you are doing? When you say you should return more, is it a recognition that every community has its own unique needs?
Oh, absolutely. And the president certainly believes, as do I, and he has stated it over and over again, that the best education is that's closest to the child. Who better than the teachers in the local communities? And I am the first to say, I think teaching is one of the most noble professions in our country. But we need to let teachers have the ability to teach. Let them be innovative. Let them work in their classrooms. Let them develop the curriculum, as long as they're meeting the standards that need to be met, but let them understanding how each classroom works and learns and the students in that classroom. I'm all for bringing in new technology like AI that gives individual students tutoring and can be happening in the classroom. I saw in one classroom that I visited, there were 25 students in the classroom, there were 25 screens. Each student was on a separate screen and that teacher was monitoring. And it's very important to have a teacher in the classroom, not this remoteness that they're just on their own, because she's able or he's able to monitor and look and say, oh, Jack is like, he's missed this sentence, or Joanna over here is like, she's way ahead on this paragraph. Okay, let's send that AI learning module to them, because it's that individual tutoring that either helps them come up to speed or gives them that ability to go on. And so that's part of, I think, a little bit higher level. We're not in that 1 through 3 at that point. We're looking more at middle school and getting into the secondary education. But boy, it's to have it local, to have those teachers be able to spend their time. I mean, today, a teacher out of every dollar comes into the classroom spends about 47 cents on regulatory compliance. So let's get this bureaucracy out of education. That's what the president's talking about. Get the bureaucracy out. We don't need a Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and then have teachers having to spend this time and that allocation of resources to compliance. Let's send it all to the states where it can be best monitored, best developed, because there is no one-size-fits-all for success in education.
Madam Secretary, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.